How do you bake a better sourdough bread? Some time ago, I asked you in my community tab if you had any sourdough baking questions for me. So many of you asked me so many questions, really good questions, that I had decided to divvy up the questions in two main categories. One on just like anything about a sourdough starter, and that video is right here. If you've missed it, you can watch it there and get all your questions answered in there. And this video today is just about how to bake a better sourdough bread. And I have here with me a sourdough bread I baked last night. I wish I could show you a little bit more of it, but it was so delicious that my family really dug into it. And yeah, that's all that's left. However, let's get to the questions. And I had to print them out so that I could actually read the whole question to you as it was asked. So this viewer says, I've learned how to make a sourdough starter and bake bread on YouTube videos in the last 6 months or so. I've watched you a lot. Each bake I do 2 boules, which are round loaves, and they turn out with very good oven spring and quite beautiful. But why, oh why, do I still have a crumb that's a little gummy and dense? It's really good to toast it. Also, my husband and I both struggle to slice it. Thank you. So there's a few things that come to my mind right away. First of all, it's great that you're baking, and I love that you're experimenting and that you're not being discouraged quite yet. One of the reasons your crumb could be a little dense and gummy is because maybe your sourdough starter is a little bit too young. A more established, ripe sourdough starter will be more active and actually has more leavening power, if you will, than a younger starter. The other reason obviously might be that you need a longer fermentation time, and if your bread dough is rising too much, you can always do a cold fermentation where you put the dough in the refrigerator for some time to keep it down a little bit but still make it ferment, and experiment with that a little bit back and forth. But please do let me know in the comments if I have answered your question enough. And also, I am linking in the show notes a playlist with all my sourdough bread videos, and there's a lot of really good videos in there that I invite you to watch in terms of how you can make your bread a little less dense, because who wants a dense bread if you can have a fluffy one, right? The next viewer is asking, is there a recipe to use it to just make a normal soft loaf of slicing bread? I also wondered if you've ever made bread using yeast water. Words don't come out today the way I want them to. My grandma made hers that way, and wondering how to start a loaf like that. Also, does it have similar benefits as sourdough? A normal slicing bread, I am thinking, is probably a sandwich bread. And I know there is another question coming up that talks or asks specifically about how to make a sandwich bread, so I'll be asking that there. However, the other question was how to make a yeast water. And you know what? That's a really good idea, and I'm going to make a video on that, so stay tuned. It will be on my channel, and if you're watching this, if you have posed this question, you can always turn on the little bell notification so that you get a notification when I publish a new video. And stay tuned, because that's a really good idea for a video. Thank you so much for the inspiration. The next viewer says, I'm struggling to get the proofing right during the second rise. I do the finger test, but I don't know how slowly is slow enough on when it rises back. I think I keep overproofing or underproofing because my crumb is still kind of gummy but edible. It's a little hard to describe in theory and not showing you, but what you're basically wanting to do is, if you have a bread dough, and obviously this is a finished baked bread, but let's say this is your dough and you do the poke test, you push in your finger and actually make quite a dent into it. Now, if it springs back right away, it is not quite ready. If it springs back slowly but doesn't come back all the way, then it is ready for baking. And it's a little bit of trial and error, and I am thinking if your crumb is gummy and dense, it is probably underproofed, is my guess, because there's not enough activity in there and it hasn't risen enough. So I would err on the side of letting it rise a little bit longer. And the worst that can happen, actually, if you experiment with it and you overproof it, is that it kind of sinks in the middle, But then maybe you can from there find where your Goldilocks zone is in terms of how long you need it, and also getting a little bit of, every time you bake a bread, before you bake it, do the poke test so you get a little bit of a point of reference for what it needs to look like before you bake it. And then you can take some notes, and then from there you will know when your bread is actually at the perfect spot. The next viewer is asking a wild question. Will you be able to cook the bread in an air fryer? And you know, that is such an interesting question that I am going to experiment with this. I don't have an air fryer, so I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to do this, but stay tuned because maybe there's going to be a video on how to make a sourdough bread in an air fryer. This viewer wants to know how to make a sourdough bread with fresh milled flour. I made my starter with fresh ground rye and then converted it to hard white wheat. I can't even find very many recipes for sourdough using fresh ground flour. Now, this is kind of interesting to me because I mostly actually mill my own flour right before I bake my bread, and I barely ever use store-bought whole grain flour. The main difference is that fresh milled flour will need a little bit more liquid, but it's going to absorb it at a slower rate than if you buy store-bought flour. So you're going to have to adjust the ratios a little bit. But also, this is a really good idea for another video because there's so much to say about how to successfully use fresh milled, home milled flour in your sourdough bread recipes that I will make a video on it. So also stay tuned for that. So many good ideas, but I feel like it's really worth an entire video and not just answering in like 2 or 3 questions. And I know that if you have that question, I know there's a lot of other people who have the same question or wondering how you can use home milled flour for bread baking. I'm trying to make my sourdough bread more sour and I can't seem to achieve that. The starter I keep in the refrigerator is made from organic rye and whole wheat, and it seems to be very active when I do use it, which is usually with bread flour. Can you help? So actually, I want to go to the next question because this user is asking, how do I make my bread taste sour? My sourdough tastes sweet and no tang. So basically, same question, same content here. The main way you can influence the sourness of your bread is by the fermentation temperature, and cooler temperatures will make your bread more sour because you will need to let it ferment longer. So if you really want to make a sour bread, you can always put your bread overnight, 12 hours and maybe even 24 hours. Experiment with that, but start with 12 in the refrigerator. And it will really need that time because it slows the fermentation down, but it also prolongs it. So that's the main way you can affect the sourness of your sourdough bread. However, I have done an entire video on that topic. It's linked right here and in the description box. So you can watch it and learn all the other ways, because there's many more ways that you can affect the sourness of your sourdough bread. How can I make my sourdough sandwich loaves softer? Really good question. The first thing you can do is adding some oil or fat. That could be, I love using avocado oil for its neutral taste, and it's actually one of the healthier oils out there, but that's maybe a topic for another video. Or you can use butter if you like the butter flavor. You can also use a loaf pan with a lid. I think they're called Pullman loaf pans or something like that, because that will keep the crust from forming and it keeps the steam on the inside of the bread, so the crust will be softer, and also the water is not evaporating as much as in a bread that we're baking in an oven and don't have any lid on it. The other thing you can also do is make a bread dough with a higher hydration. In other words, use more liquid, make a softer, runnier dough than you would for a shaped loaf like this. And then you will actually need a loaf pan like that, because otherwise your bread dough would just like flow out and shape itself into a long pancake, which is what you don't want to do. So try these tips. If you already have a recipe that's not quite working for you, see if you can just add a little bit of butter or oil, use a Pullman loaf pan with a lid on it, and see if you can make the dough just a little bit wetter. And the next question is, after my starter is alive, made by your recommendation and recipe, I put flour in the fridge, and what then? I want to know from there till baked loaf, how to use it and how to bake simple bread with it. Also, very good question. In my method, which is different from most other methods out there, I have my sourdough starter, and actually, why don't I go get it and show you what it looks like. I just pulled this out of the refrigerator, and I'm going to show to you. It looks very dry because I add a lot of flour to it. I'm going to show it to this camera too. And what I do the night before I want to bake is I take out some of it, and you really only need very little. And then I add flour and water. Now in my original method, and I have a video exactly here, how I use my sourdough starter, and I have another video, so just go through my playlist because I have various videos on how I use my sourdough starter and how you can keep it in the refrigerator and bake with it. But more recently, what I have been doing, also for this bread here that my family has been digging into more than I wanted and couldn't keep their hands off of it, is I use a small amount of this dry starter. I add pretty much the same amount of flour and water, mix it all up and let it sit overnight. And then the next day you can theoretically bake with it. You can also do another feeding, no discarding, but add a little bit more flour and water to it. And then in the evening of that day, you have an active sourdough starter. If you're not wanting to bake in the evening, you can easily put that in the refrigerator and use it the next day. It won't have lost any of its activity. However, I have this entire video here in which I'm showing you front to back, beginning to end, how I use my sourdough starter. And again, if you have questions, leave them below this video. I'm always happy to hear from you and to answer any comments. I wanted to show this bread to you. This is a mostly rye flour bread with mostly home milled rye flour, and there's a little bit of white flour in there. And I have used a German recipe that I found from a bakery. However, I call myself the queen of eyeballing and the queen of winging it. So I look at a recipe, and this is maybe 80% according to the recipe, and the remaining 20% is my own creation and invention, if you will. And I'm going to make a video about that because this bread is so delicious. Like I said, my family has been digging into it, and so many videos that will come up. I'm going to be really busy recording all of those, but I look forward to doing that because that's what I love doing, bringing you fresh content and fresh recipes. In the meantime, if you want to start baking bread, you can watch this video right here in which I teach you a very simple sourdough bread. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.